I didn't raise my voice. I didn't spill a drink. I asked one calm question and watched a woman who had been laughing at me realize she'd made a serious mistake. The invitation was printed on heavy cream paper, embossed logo, clean font. His company spared no expense reminding people who held power and who orbited it. I almost didn't go. Not because I was afraid, because I already knew. By then, the affair wasn't a suspicion. It was a completed thought, the kind that settles in your chest and doesn't move no matter how you breathe around it. Receipts don't always come as lipstick on collars or text messages left unlocked. Sometimes they arrive as patterns, timing, silence where there used to be routine. My husband had been sleeping peacefully for weeks. That was the first sign. At the party, the room was loud with practiced laughter. Men in tailored suits loosening their ties just enough to appear approachable. Women in dresses chosen carefully. Expensive, but not threatening. Strategic elegance. And there she was, his secretary. Young. Confident in the way people are when they think proximity to power is the same thing as power itself. She stood with a group near the bar, her body angled outward like she was on display. Laughing too hard, touching arms, performing. I watched her before she noticed me. She knew who I was. That was obvious. She had studied me the way people study obstacles, evaluating size, resistance, likelihood of removal. When her eyes finally met mine, there was a flicker. Not guilt, recognition. Then she smiled. Later, when I passed the group, I heard her voice behind me. Not loud. Loud enough. Some women just let themselves go after marriage, she said. Guess they think the ring does the work. The group laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was easy. I stopped walking. I turned around slowly, not sharply, not dramatically. I didn't want adrenaline. I wanted control. She was still smiling when she looked at me again. That smile assumed I would either explode or retreat. Most people do one or the other. She was prepared for both. I stepped closer. Close enough that she could smell my perfume. Close enough that the laughter thinned. I looked directly at her and asked calmly, "Do you know how long affairs last when they begin at work?" Silence landed like weight. Her smile froze, not cracked. Froze. Because she hadn't prepared for that question. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't emotional. It was factual, professional, dangerous. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I continued, still calm. Because HR tracks patterns. So do attorneys, and so do men when they decide who's replaceable. Someone shifted uncomfortably. A glass clinked against the bar. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her looks, or her age, or her ambition. I didn't need to. I was speaking from a position she didn't have. Permanence. She swallowed. I didn't mean, she started. I tilted my head slightly. Not in curiosity. In assessment. "Oh, I know exactly what you meant," I said. "I was just curious whether you understood the math." That was it. I didn't wait for her response. I didn't need it. When I turned away, the laughter didn't come back. Conversations restarted cautiously, like engines after a stall. I felt eyes on my back, not admiring, not hostile. Alert. Across the room, my husband was watching me. His face told me everything. Surprise, fear, calculation. He hadn't expected me to show up composed. He had expected damage, tears, an embarrassing scene that would let him dismiss me later as unstable. Instead, I had done the worst possible thing. I had been calm. That night when we left the party, he asked me what I'd said to her. "Nothing dramatic," I replied. "Just a question." He didn't press further. He already knew better. And for the first time since the truth settled into my body, I slept deeply. Not because I forgave anything. Because I had drawn a line, quietly, publicly, and without asking permission. People assume betrayal arrives like a thunderclap. It doesn't. It arrives quietly, polite, almost considerate. I knew before the party, not because I found proof, but because the air in my own house changed. And I pay attention to things like that. My husband stopped asking questions he used to ask without thinking. How my day was. Whether I'd eaten. If I was tired. Those weren't acts of care anymore. They were liabilities. Questions invite answers. Answers invite exposure. He became efficient instead. Kind in a streamlined way. Like someone managing a project they were almost finished with. The second sign was his phone. Not the usual cliches. No sudden password changes. No frantic screen flips. He didn't need to hide. He'd already rewritten the rules in his head. The phone lived face up on the counter, confident, secure, like a man who believed nothing on it belonged to me anymore. Then there was the way he talked about work, names dropped casually, hers included, always in professional tones, too polished, as if he were rehearsing neutrality for an audience that wasn't there yet. "She's very capable," he said once, pouring coffee. "She anticipates things before I ask." That sentence stayed with me. Men rarely praise anticipation unless they're enjoying what it saves them from. In this case, effort, inconvenience, accountability. The third sign was physical. He slept better. Deep sleep is a confession. It means the body isn't bracing for consequences anymore. It means decisions have been made, the kind that let a person rest. I lay awake beside him some nights, listening to the evenness of his breathing, and understood something important. He wasn't conflicted. That clarity hurt more than guilt ever could have. I didn't confront him, not because I was afraid, but because confrontation assumes ignorance. I wasn't ignorant. I was observing. I watched how he positioned himself in rooms now. Slightly angled away from me, not fully distant, just enough to practice, like someone learning a new posture. I watched how he dressed for work. Sharper, more intentional, clothes chosen to be noticed, not respected. That's a distinction women learn early. And I watched myself. I noticed that I didn't cry. Not once. My body didn't move toward panic. It moved toward stillness, toward inventory. People talk about denial, but what I felt was assessment. I asked myself practical questions. How long had this been going on? What version of himself was he feeding her? What version of me had he already discarded? By the time the party invitation arrived, I understood the shape of things. The secretary wasn't the betrayal. She was the symptom, a convenient witness to his need to be reflected differently. Younger, admired without context, untouched by history. She didn't know me. That was clear. She knew the outline he'd drawn. The version of a wife who was dull, distant, safely diminished. Men hand those stories out generously when they want permission. What surprised him was that I showed up. What surprised her was that I didn't play the role she'd rehearsed for me. That night after the party, when we got home, he loosened his tie and asked if I was tired. The question was careful, neutral, a probe. "No," I said. "I'm very awake." He nodded, like that was acceptable. We didn't argue. We didn't talk. He went to bed expecting the silence to protect him. It didn't. I lay there thinking about the moment her laughter died, how fast it happened, how fragile confidence is when it's built on someone else's marriage. That was when I understood something else. I didn't need to expose the affair yet. I didn't need proof. I didn't even need his confession. What I needed was timing, because affairs thrive in secrecy, but they die in sequence, and I had already begun arranging mine. My husband liked systems, hierarchies, clear lanes, predictable outcomes. That's why he thrived at work. And why he thought he could manage an affair the same way, quietly, efficiently, without mess. In his world, everything had a place. Wives were stabilizers. They hosted. They remembered birthdays. They absorbed stress so men could perform elsewhere. They were background infrastructure. Necessary, but not visible. Secretaries were different. Secretaries existed in daylight hours only. They saw men at their sharpest, decisive, praised, uninterrupted. They didn't see laundry piles or dead parents or the way a man ages when no one is watching. They saw performance, not maintenance. That illusion is powerful. I understood that before he ever tried to explain it to me. He started staying late. Not absurdly late, just late enough to normalize absence. He framed it as pressure, opportunity, growth, the kind of language men use when they want applause for neglect. "I'm doing this for us," he said once, loosening his cufflinks. A sentence designed to end discussion. I let it end. At work, he was respected. Not brilliant, just reliable. The kind of man who knew how to speak last in meetings and sound reasonable. The kind who let louder people exhaust themselves and then offered a solution that looked like leadership. She sat outside his office every day. Gatekeeper, scheduler, witness. She learned his rhythms. When he needed coffee, when to interrupt, when not to. She learned which version of him earned praise and which earned irritation. That knowledge creates intimacy faster than attraction ever could. I'm not naive about that. But intimacy doesn't equal immunity. What she didn't understand, what he didn't explain, was the structure above them both. The policies written in bland language, the legal consequences dressed up as professionalism. The way companies protect themselves first and men second. And what he forgot, conveniently, was me. Not as a wife, as a variable. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't reactive. I didn't collapse into the role he'd assigned me in advance. That made me unpredictable. Men don't fear anger as much as they fear uncertainty. He thought silence meant safety. What it meant was preparation. I began to notice how often her name appeared in his calendar, how frequently meetings were rescheduled, how praise of her work increased as distance between us did. Men overcompensate when they feel watched, even if the watcher never announces herself. At dinner one night, he mentioned her again, casually. "She's been invaluable lately." I took a sip of water. "Is that why you stopped looping HR on your meetings?" I asked. He froze, just for a second, barely visible, but I saw it. "What do you mean?" he said. I smiled faintly. "Nothing, just an observation." That was the moment the rules shifted. He realized I wasn't unaware, but he still didn't understand the extent of it. He thought awareness would turn into pleading, or ultimatums, or grief. Instead, it turned into distance. At work, his world relied on the assumption that private lives stayed private, that wives stayed home, that secrets stayed compartmentalized. That assumption was his real mistake, because I didn't want to storm his office. I didn't want to call her names. I didn't want to be seen as the problem that needed managing. I wanted the system to do what it always does when people underestimate it. I wanted time. And time, I knew, was already working for me. Confidence is loud when it's borrowed. She wore it like perfume, noticeable, unnecessary, meant to linger after she left the room. At the office party, I watched how she moved through people, not above them. Through them, testing reactions, collecting proof of her effect. She believed she was chosen. That belief changes posture. It sharpens smiles. It makes people careless. I saw it in the way she spoke to men who outranked her. Casual, teasing, unafraid. I saw it in how she ignored women she assumed were irrelevant. And I saw it most clearly in how she spoke about me without ever saying my name. People think mistresses are reckless. Some are. Most aren't. Most are strategic. They just misjudge where the strategy ends. She thought she had access. She didn't understand exposure. In her mind, I was already obsolete. A placeholder wife. A woman whose usefulness had expired quietly, politely, without complaint. That narrative doesn't come from nowhere. Men supply it carefully, like a briefing document. I don't blame her for believing him. I blame her for underestimating me. After the party, her behavior changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. She didn't look at me again that night. Avoidance is a form of respect when fear enters the equation. At work, she tightened, overcorrected, laughed less, watched more. That told me something important. She hadn't been warned, she hadn't been reassured, and she hadn't been protected. Men who plan to leave their wives make promises. Men who plan to keep their wives make contingencies. He had done neither well. A week later, my husband mentioned her again, this time with irritation. "She's been a little distracted," he said. I nodded. People get that way when they realize they're visible. He studied me then. Not suspiciously, cautiously, like someone standing near thin ice. I didn't explain myself. What she didn't know, what he assumed I wouldn't dare, was that I had started talking. Quietly, appropriately, to people who didn't gossip but did document. I didn't accuse. I asked neutral questions, hypotheticals, clarifications, policy language. I learned how long investigations take, what triggers reviews, which behaviors create patterns. She thought her confidence came from desire. It didn't. It came from ignorance. And ignorance doesn't survive long in professional environments built on liability. I didn't need to touch her career. I just needed to stop protecting it. The moment she mocked me at that party, she broke an unspoken rule: discretion. Affairs can survive secrecy. They cannot survive arrogance. She thought I was humiliated. What I was finished waiting. And she was just beginning to understand what that meant. People imagine confrontations as explosions, raised voices, shaking hands, words you can't take back. That's not how this one happened. It happened on a Tuesday. No significance to the day, no symbolism, just a quiet evening where the house sounded exactly the way it always had. Dishwasher humming, the faint tick of the clock in the hallway, the ordinary noises of a life he assumed was still intact. He came home later than usual. Not apologetic, not defensive, just alert. That told me something had shifted. I was at the kitchen counter reading, not pretending to read, actually reading. When I looked up, he hesitated. Men hesitate when they sense they're about to lose control of a narrative. "Can we talk?" he asked. I closed the book, carefully. I wanted him to notice that nothing about me was rushed. "Of course," I said. "About what?" He exhaled, sat down across from me, placed his phone face down on the table, a habit that had returned recently. He thought that mattered. "I feel like there's distance between us," he began. There it was. The opening line men use when they want to sound reflective without admitting guilt. Passive, vague, safe. "I agree," I said. That surprised him. He'd expected resistance, or reassurance. "I don't know when it started," he continued, "but lately it feels like you're elsewhere." I met his eyes. "I am," I said. Silence stretched. He didn't interrupt this time. "I'm no longer invested in protecting what you've already stepped outside of." His jaw tightened. Not anger, calculation. "That's not fair," he said quietly. "You're assuming things." "No," I replied. "I'm observing them." I didn't accuse him of cheating. Not yet. Accusations invite debate. Debate gives liars oxygen. Instead, I asked one question. "Do you think I don't notice when someone else is scheduling your priorities?" His eyes flicked away before he could stop them. There it was. I leaned back in my chair. Calm. Still. "You don't need to explain," I said. "And I don't need details. I already know the shape of it." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture he hadn't used in years. "It's complicated," he said. I nodded once. "It always is. Until it isn't." He looked at me then, really looked at me, like he was seeing a version of me he hadn't planned for. "I never meant to hurt you." I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. "Intent doesn't outrank impact," I said, "and comfort doesn't excuse betrayal." That word finally landed between us. Betrayal. Solid. Undeniable. He didn't deny it. Instead, he tried to minimize it. "It didn't start the way you think," he said. "It just happened." I stood up, not abruptly, deliberately. "Nothing that happens repeatedly is accidental," I said, "and nothing that requires secrecy is innocent." He opened his mouth again, but I raised my hand. "No," I said. "This isn't the part where you justify yourself. This is the part where I tell you what happens next." That scared him. Men are comfortable with anger. They understand tears. They know how to wait out grief. What they don't know how to manage is a woman who has already decided. "I'm not going to fight you," I continued. "I'm not going to beg. And I'm not going to embarrass myself pretending this can be repaired on your terms." His face tightened. "So that's it?" he asked. "For us," I said. "Yes." He stared at me like he was searching for leverage. "And her?" he asked too quickly. I met his eyes again, cold this time. "She's your professional liability," I said. "Not my competition." That landed harder than anything else I'd said. I walked past him then, down the hallway, and closed the bedroom door behind me, not to shut him out, to mark the end of access. That night, he slept on the couch. I slept without interruption. No tears, no shaking, no second-guessing. Because by the time the confrontation arrived, the decision had already been made, and the real consequences hadn't even started yet. Men don't confess when they're cornered. They negotiate. The morning after the couch, he acted almost normal. Too normal. He made coffee, read the news, moved through the kitchen like muscle memory could undo what had already been said. That's how I knew he was preparing his case. Justifications don't come from remorse. They come from fear. Fear of loss, fear of exposure, fear that the story will be told without their edits. By noon, he tried again. "This doesn't have to be final," he said, standing in the doorway of my office. He didn't step inside. That mattered. "I'm listening," I replied, without looking up. He took that as permission. "I was under a lot of pressure," he began. "Work has been intense. Expectations keep increasing. I felt invisible." I almost smiled. Invisible men don't get promotions. Invisible men don't get admiration at work. Invisible men don't attract attention from younger women eager to validate them. But I let him continue. Justifications unravel best when uninterrupted. "She listened," he said. "She understood what I was dealing with." I finally looked at him then. "She listened because it benefited her," I said. "That's not understanding. That's strategy." He frowned. "You're being unfair." "No," I said calmly. "I'm being accurate." He shifted his weight, irritation creeping in. That was the next phase, when justification turns into defensiveness. "I never stopped loving you," he said. That one was almost convincing. Almost. "Love isn't passive," I replied, "and it doesn't require secrecy to survive." He ran a hand over his face. "You've changed," he said. "You're colder, distant." There it was, the reversal, the attempt to relocate responsibility. "I changed because I stopped pretending," I said. "You just noticed late." He stared at me like he didn't recognize me anymore. That was true. He didn't. The version of me he knew was cooperative, interpretable, willing to carry discomfort quietly so he didn't have to. That woman was gone. "What do you want me to say?" he asked finally. "That I made a mistake?" I considered the question. "No," I said. "Mistakes end when they're recognized. This adapted." He flinched. "You're acting like this was calculated," he said. "It was," I answered. "Just not on your part." He didn't ask what I meant by that. Some instincts survive even arrogance. "I can end it," he said quickly, "if that's what you want." That offer was revealing, not generous, desperate. I shook my head. "You already did," I said. "You just didn't notice when." Silence settled between us again. He was running out of angles. "What about forgiveness?" he asked. "People work through worse than this." I stood up, slowly, deliberately, the way I always did now. "Forgiveness requires accountability," I said, "and accountability requires consequences." His voice tightened. "So you're punishing me?" "No," I replied. "I'm releasing myself." That distinction mattered. He looked smaller then, not pitiful, just diminished, a man realizing his narrative had expired. When he left the room, he closed the door softly. That, more than anything, confirmed what I already knew. He finally understood he wasn't in control anymore, and the world he'd built on quiet assumptions was about to discover the cost of them. People imagined betrayal as collapse, a woman crying in a bathroom, a voice breaking on the phone to a friend, wine poured too early in the evening and finished too late at night. They imagine devastation because devastation is legible. It reassures everyone else that the world still makes sense, that harm looks dramatic, that strength announces itself loudly. Mine didn't. Mine looked like precision. I went to work. I answered emails. I paid attention. That unsettled people more than grief ever would have. Friends noticed first, not because I told them, because I didn't. Silence makes people nervous, especially when it's deliberate. "You seem okay," one of them said carefully. "I am," I replied. They waited for more. There wasn't any. What they didn't understand was that betrayal doesn't always break you. Sometimes it clarifies you. It strips away the last excuse you had for tolerating things you never agreed to in the first place. I wasn't mourning my marriage. I was mourning the time I'd wasted maintaining a fiction. At home, the atmosphere shifted. He moved cautiously now, like someone who knows the floor plan but suspects traps. He stopped making plans that assumed my participation. He stopped touching my things. He stopped asking questions he didn't want answered. That restraint wasn't respect. It was fear of triggering something he couldn't control. At work, consequences began moving. Slowly, invisibly, exactly the way institutions prefer. Meetings that included an extra person, emails copied higher than necessary. Processes reviewed for consistency. She felt it before he did. Stress changes posture. She stopped laughing as freely, stopped speaking over others, stopped assuming immunity. Confidence based on secrecy collapses when light enters the room. I heard about it secondhand. I always did. Someone mentioned she'd been reassigned. Someone else mentioned a review. Nothing concrete, nothing dramatic. That's how real consequences arrive. Not with spectacle, with procedure. He tried once more to reach me emotionally. "I miss us," he said one evening, standing too close. I stepped back. "You miss stability," I replied. "Not intimacy." That ended that attempt. People think closure comes from conversations. It doesn't. It comes from alignment, when your actions finally match what you know. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need validation. I didn't need her to suffer. I needed separation. Clean. Irreversible. And as the weeks passed, I noticed something else. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires attachment, investment, hope that something might still change. What I felt was quieter, resolve. The story everyone expected, the one where I unravel, never happened. Instead, another one was unfolding, one where betrayal wasn't the climax. It was the exit. Consequences don't announce themselves. They settle in quietly, then refuse to leave. By the time he realized something was wrong, it was already too late to correct course. That's the part people miss. They think accountability arrives with warnings. It doesn't. It arrives after assumptions have already hardened into mistakes. The first consequence was professional. He came home one evening later than usual, jacket still on, movements sharp. He didn't speak right away. He poured a drink he didn't finish. "They're restructuring," he said finally. I didn't look up. "Are they?" I replied. He watched me carefully, trying to detect triumph. There was none, just neutrality. "My department's being reviewed," he continued. "Compliance, oversight." I nodded once. "That happens when boundaries blur," I said. He stiffened. "This has nothing to do with you," he snapped. I met his eyes then. "Everything has something to do with me," I said. "You just forgot that." He didn't respond. A week later, her name disappeared from his calendar. Not erased, reassigned, moved somewhere less visible, less influential, less protected. He didn't mention her again after that. The second consequence was social. People who had once invited us as a unit began to hesitate. Invitations softened, shifted, became conditional. "Just you?" they'd say to me. Or worse, we weren't sure what was appropriate. Appropriate is a word people use when they sense fracture, but don't want responsibility for acknowledging it. He noticed the shift too. He always did, just late. "People are acting strange," he said one night. "They're adjusting," I replied. "So am I." The third consequence was internal. That one surprised him the most. He began to look tired, not stressed, exposed, as if the version of himself he'd been maintaining required more energy now that no one was reinforcing it. He asked fewer questions, offered fewer opinions. The man who once spoke with quiet authority now paused before sentences, unsure how they'd land. That kind of erosion isn't loud, it's steady. One evening, he asked me something I hadn't expected. "Do you hate me?" he said. I considered it honestly. "No," I replied. "Hatred would mean you still occupy emotional space. You don't." That hurt him more than anger ever could have. He moved out 2 weeks later. No fight, no argument, just boxes and silence and logistics handled through short sentences. The secretary transferred departments shortly after. Officially voluntary, unofficially necessary. I heard she left the company within 6 months. I didn't ask where she went. By then, consequences had finished their work. What remained was quiet, clean, undeniable. People think justice is dramatic. It isn't. It's alignment. And when alignment finally arrives, everything that depended on distortion collapses under its own weight. The shift didn't feel triumphant. It felt precise. That surprised me. I had expected relief to arrive loudly, some internal release, some emotional punctuation mark that told me I was done. Instead, it came the way adulthood usually does, quietly, with responsibility intact. The house changed first. Not physically, energetically. Rooms lost their tension. Mornings stopped feeling anticipatory, like I was bracing for something unnamed. I rearranged furniture without consulting anyone, bought groceries based solely on what I wanted to eat. Let silence exist without filling it. Autonomy is subtle until you've lived without it. People started asking questions then. Real ones. "How are you holding up? Are you okay being alone? Do you miss him?" I answered honestly. "I'm not alone. No, not the way people think." What I didn't say was this. I missed the version of myself that didn't negotiate for space. That version was back now. At work, I noticed my voice had changed, not louder, clearer. I stopped cushioning statements, stopped offering unnecessary context to make others comfortable. That adjustment alone altered how people responded to me. Men listened differently, women leaned in. It wasn't power, it was alignment. I also noticed how often people tried to rewrite what had happened, for their own comfort. Well, these things are complicated. Midlife does strange things to people. I'm sure he didn't mean for it to go this far. Those explanations weren't for me. They were for them. Stories they told themselves so betrayal didn't feel so close to home. I didn't correct them. You don't argue with denial, you outgrow it. One afternoon, months later, I ran into someone from his office. Polite conversation, neutral updates. "He seems different," they said carefully. I nodded. "Change tends to do that." They hesitated. "And you?" they asked. "You seem steadier." I smiled then. Not for them, for myself. "I stopped carrying things that weren't mine," I said. That was the truth. I didn't rebuild my life dramatically. No reinvention montage, no radical declarations. I simply removed what required constant compromise of my dignity. What remained was enough. I didn't win. I didn't lose. I concluded. And that distinction, That quiet, uncelebrated ending was the real shift. Because once you stop framing your life as a reaction to someone else's choices, you become unmovable. There was only one thing left to do now. Not confront the past, but decide what deserved access to me next. Aftermath isn't loud. That's the first lie people believe. That endings roar. That something explodes so everyone knows a chapter has closed. Real endings don't announce themselves. They leave behind space, and space tells the truth. By the time the paperwork was finalized, I felt nothing sharp. No victory, no bitterness, just accuracy. Everything was where it belonged. People asked if I felt closure. I didn't answer right away. Closure is a word people use when they want something to be finished without being understood. I didn't need closure. I needed integrity. And I had it. I saw him once, months later, briefly, accidentally, neutral ground. He looked older, not because of time, because of reckoning. Some people age when they're forced to live without the stories that protected them. He smiled, unsure. "You look well," he said. "I am," I replied. He nodded, like that was confirmation of something he'd already lost. He didn't mention her. I didn't mention anything. We exchanged pleasantries the way strangers do. And that was the final proof. Strangers don't owe each other explanations. I walked away without turning back. Not because I was strong, because I was done. Here's what people never tell you about betrayal. It doesn't end when the affair ends. It ends when you stop reorganizing yourself around someone else's choices. I didn't rebuild my life out of spite. I didn't improve myself to prove anything. I didn't become harder. I became clearer. And clarity is ruthless in the best way. That calm question I asked at the party wasn't bravery. It was alignment speaking for the first time out loud. Once that happens, everything else is just logistics. This wasn't a story about a secretary or a husband or even infidelity. It was a story about a moment when I stopped being editable. And once that happens, no one ever laughs at you again.